Official royal portraits, LI. For 1,000 years, painters straightened the crooked spines and slimmed the swollen legs, and the drool never reached the canvas at all, because nobody commissions a picture of a king mid-seizure. The written record kept better notes. Tucked inside physicians' journals, courtiers' letters, and the unusually candid biography written by one Welsh monk, the British monarchy amounts to a long parade of bodies that refuse to cooperate with the job description. What follows comes from those records, arranged from the most recent king backward to the oldest. Consider the evidence. One king of England and Scotland could not walk until age 7 and drooled through affairs of state. Another monarch, aged 15, coughed up pieces of his own lungs while foreign ambassadors took notes. One queen arrived at her own coronation in the arms of her attendants because her ruined joints refused the trip, and one warrior king's lifelong abdominal agony introduced itself with vicious comic timing at his own wedding feast. Physicians named some of these conditions on the spot, right at the bedside. Others waited centuries for exhumed skeletons and DNA labs to settle on a diagnosis, and a few remain contested to this day. A few rulers hid their conditions behind tailoring and protocol, others governed in plain sight of symptoms nobody could ignore, and at least one turned his affliction into part of the royal brand. Meet 13 royals whose bodies wrote themselves into the history books. Albert Frederick Arthur George arrived in 1895, a second son never expected to reign. With a body that seemed to agree completely with that arrangement, childhood treated him roughly. To correct his knock knees, a condition doctors call genu valgum, physicians strapped the boy's legs into painful braces that pinned them straight for hours at a time. And while the hardware forcibly reshaped his legs, a severe stammer seized his speech and never fully released it. The braces eventually did their orthopedic work, and the knock knees faded from the record. The stammer stayed. It shadowed him through ceremonies, audiences, and every occasion that demanded words from a man whose words kept jamming, and plenty of observers quietly concluded that this fragile second son lacked the material for a throne. Their conclusion aged very badly. None of this needed modern detective work. Courtiers watched him fight for every sentence. Audiences heard the long silences, and the medical records preserved the misery of the leg braces in full detail. His timing bordered on cruel. Radio, newly arrived, turned the monarchy into a speaking profession, which meant a stammering prince now faced a technology purpose-built to broadcast his greatest weakness into every living room in Britain. A medieval king could scowl impressively from a distance. A 20th century king leaned into a microphone while millions listened for the stumble. Every royal duty now came with a speech attached, and every speech loomed ahead of him like a scheduled humiliation. The crown reached him anyway in 1936 after his elder brother walked away from it. Skeptics considered the new king too frail and too timid for the job. They underestimated his stubbornness. George answered with work rather than words, drilling for years alongside the Australian speech therapist Lionel Logue, fighting his own mouth syllable by syllable until it obeyed. The great test came in September 1939. Seated before a live microphone, George VI announced to his people that Britain now stood at war with Germany, and the broadcast carried through without disaster. That single wartime address rewrote his reputation. The prince, once dismissed as fragile, hardened in the public mind into a dutiful and resilient king, an image he kept until his death in 1952. Radio, the technology that terrified him, became the stage where he proved himself. His father's courtiers knew a boy who could barely speak. His subjects remembered a man who refused to stay silent. Prince John Charles Francis, born in 1905 as the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, spent most of his short life hidden from the country his family ruled. His first epileptic seizure struck at age 4. Queen Mary tracked the family's growing alarm in her diaries, and his devoted governess, Charlotte Lala Bill, kept her own record of the seizures and the developmental delays that deepened alongside them. From then on, The attacks kept returning, and the boy's cognitive development slid backward while his doctors watched, unable to do much of anything. Edwardian Britain treated epilepsy as a shame rather than an illness. The condition carried crushing social stigma and almost no medical understanding, so the palace withdrew John from public view by degrees, settling him at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate with Lala Bill for company. There, the boy lived apart while his siblings grew up in front of the cameras. Lala Bill stayed through all of it, a governess who slowly became his entire world. Modern commentators have pushed past the historical record and speculated that John may also have belonged somewhere on the autism spectrum, an idea historians file under interesting but unprovable. The end arrived quickly. In 1919, at just 13, John died at Wood Farm after a severe seizure, closing a life most of Britain never knew existed. Later, critics accused the royal family of warehousing an epileptic child out of embarrassment, and the charge carries real weight, but the surviving letters complicate the verdict. They reveal two parents who grieved hard for a son they deeply loved. His story resurfaced decades afterward as a cautionary tale about stigma, argued over by historians who never met the family and settled in part by letters written by the people who did. Protocol hid the boy. It never left him unloved. Prince Leopold entered the family of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert in 1853, their youngest son, and his blood betrayed him almost from the start. Royal physicians diagnosed hemophilia during his own lifetime, no retrospective guesswork required, and their files bulge with notes on swollen joints, lameness, and hemorrhages that could turn a bumped shin into a medical emergency. Mild epilepsy piled on top of the bleeding. A boy who bled that easily could not live an ordinary royal childhood, and Leopold never received one. Victoria responded with total control. She restricted his activities, monitored his health obsessively, and tried to wrap her breakable son in permanent cotton wool, an arrangement Leopold spent his whole life fighting. Her protectiveness, suffocating as it felt, grew from arithmetic she understood perfectly well because her son's blood refused to clot, and the world held no shortage of sharp corners. Hungry for intellectual independence, he pushed his way to Oxford University and built a life of the mind while his body kept threatening to cancel it, all under the added weight of the stigma Victorian society attached to his epilepsy. Freedom cost him effort at every step. Hemophilia collected its debt in 1884 when a minor fall triggered a cerebral hemorrhage and killed the Duke of Albany at 31. The lameness and joint pain shadowed him from childhood. The end needed only a stumble. Science added a strange postscript in 2009. DNA testing on the exhumed remains of his Romanov relatives finally identified the exact family disorder as hemophilia B, delivering a precise diagnosis 125 years after the patient died of it. King George III ruled for 60 years. For long stretches of that reign, his own mind ranked among the most dangerous territories in the kingdom, and his doctors' notebooks read like horror diaries: mania, insomnia, physical spasms, abdominal pain, crushing weakness, and strangest of all, urine that turned blue or reddish in the pot. Born in 1738 and crowned in 1760, George governed capably for decades before the episodes began arriving. His physicians recorded every attack with the meticulous horror of men documenting something they could not explain. That colorful urine launched one of medicine's great arguments. In the 1960s, the psychiatrists Ida McAlpine and Richard Hunter reviewed the old records and announced a retrospective diagnosis of acute intermittent porphyria, a metabolic disorder capable of discoloring urine and scrambling the nervous system, and their theory dominated books and films about the Mad King for a generation. Then the thread pulling started. Many modern medical historians now argue for bipolar disorder instead, and they explain the famous urine with an almost insulting simplicity. His doctors kept dosing him with gentian root, and gentian root changes the color. The most notorious symptom of his madness may have flowed straight out of his own medicine cabinet. The label changes the man. Porphyria framed George as a physically ill man whose mind fell as collateral damage, while bipolar disorder frames the mania itself as the illness, and each version produces a different king. Doctors of his own era possessed neither label. They recorded what they saw and waited out each episode with the limited tools of the 18th century. Whatever the correct label, the constitutional damage happened in real time. His 1788 collapse set off the Regency crisis, with Parliament scrambling to decide who would govern if the king could not, and politicians who spent careers courting the king began planning openly for a kingdom without him in charge. That round he survived. By 1811, the recovery stopped coming, and permanent mental and physical decline forced the creation of a regency under his son, while the old king lived on in seclusion for 9 more years. George III died in 1820 at 81, a monarch remembered less for 6 decades on the throne than for the illness that kept dragging him off it. Queen Anne inherited 3 kingdoms in 1702 and could not walk to her own crowning. Attendants carried her in. By her late 30s, gout and chronic joint inflammation wrecked her body so thoroughly that contemporaries wrote openly about the swelling, the immobility, and the weight gain that reached what physicians classed as morbid obesity. Guests at the ceremony watched a 37-year-old queen borne through her own coronation like cargo. Gout, at the turn of the 18th century, respected no rank. The Queen's version attacked relentlessly, swelling her joints and stealing her mobility one royal duty at a time, until walking itself became an event that required planning. Contemporaries recorded it all without much delicacy. A sovereign who could not stand unaided supplied irresistible commentary, and the commentary survives. The gout honestly counts as the smaller tragedy. Anne carried 17 pregnancies. Popular history claims every one of them failed before birth, but the record disagrees. She delivered living children, and one of them, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, survived to age 11 before dying and taking the Stuart line's last real hope with him. Each loss compounded the one before it, and still the Queen kept trying. 17 pregnancies and not one heir left standing. Modern medical historians study that obstetric catastrophe alongside her severe arthritis and propose an autoimmune culprit underneath it all, most likely systemic lupus erythematosus or Hughes syndrome, an antiphospholipid condition that attacks pregnancies from within. Her body dictated her government. Too immobile for pageantry and progresses, Anne ruled largely from her chambers, running 3 kingdoms from rooms she struggled to leave. Ministers traveled to the Queen because the Queen could no longer travel to them. The consequences outlasted her by centuries. Illness, in her case, redirected an entire dynasty. With no child surviving her, the Act of Settlement of 1701 steered the crown away from her Catholic relatives. And when Anne died in 1714 at 49, the throne left the Stuarts entirely and landed on the House of Hanover. Every British monarch since traces the job back in part to her losses. King William III seized the English throne in 1689 and then discovered that its own capital city kept quietly trying to kill him. Contemporaries described a short, stunted man with a hunched, kyphotic spine and a relentless, hacking cough that followed him through every room of every palace he occupied. Illness pursued him from his Dutch childhood onward. His doctors named the trouble on the spot. Asthma, no modern reinterpretation required. London's damp, smoggy air tore at his lungs so viciously that he relocated the entire royal court, abandoning Whitehall for the cleaner air of Kensington Palace and Hampton Court, in what amounted to a real estate decision dictated by a respiratory system. Whitehall's loss became Kensington's gain, and both palaces owe part of their royal history to one man's lungs. None of it slowed his soldiering. Observers who expected a frail invalid met a commander instead, one who kept armies moving while his own chest fought him for every breath. Stooped and wheezing, William campaigned tirelessly until his death in 1702, proof that a bent spine can still sit perfectly straight on a throne. King Charles I started life in 1600 as a sickly child who walked late, talked late, and never fully caught up with either milestone. Court records describe bowed legs and a general weakness. His contemporaries filed vaguely under weak joints, and the young prince clomped around in specially reinforced boots built to prop up his feeble ankles. Those boots survive in the record as a small, sad detail, a future king of 3 kingdoms laced into hardware because his own ankles refused the work. A stubborn stammer completed the picture. Modern medical historians agree almost universally on the retrospective diagnosis of childhood rickets, the bone-softening product of vitamin D deficiency, a name his own doctors never possessed. His body eventually strengthened, his confidence never did. Ashamed of the frailty and the stammer, Charles armored himself in rigidity, cultivating an aloof, uncompromising public manner that everyone around him read as plain arrogance. Insecurity, hardened into policy, eventually cost him his head. Centuries before George VI conquered a microphone with the same affliction, Charles faced a parliament instead, and their stories finish as far apart as a broadcast and a beheading. A king who cannot or will not communicate with his parliament invites catastrophe, and Charles's failures on that front fed the confrontations that erupted into the English Civil War. Parliament won. In 1649, the axe fell on a monarch whose troubles traced all the way back to soft bones and a stubborn tongue. King James, sixth of that name in Scotland and first in England, could not walk until the age of 7. Even as an adult, he crossed his palaces leaning heavily on courtiers' shoulders, and observers recorded a tongue too large for his mouth that thickened his speech and left him drooling, a trait modern physicians label macroglossia. The leaning habit followed him from Edinburgh to London and never left him. His court noticed everything and wrote most of it down. Retrospective diagnoses for James run all over the map. Historians have proposed mild cerebral palsy, severe infantile rickets, and Charcot-Marie tooth disease, a hereditary neuromuscular disorder, without ever settling the argument because a strange gait and an oversized tongue can only tell modern doctors so much across 4 centuries. What the record shows clearly is the gossip. Court satire ran on physical detail, and James supplied plenty of it. James's habit of draping himself across a rotation of handsome male favorites, driven at least partly by genuine physical need, kept the court satirists supplied with material for decades. None of it dulled the mind attached to that unsteady body. Where other monarchs projected power through physical presence, James projected it through argument, patronage, and a talent for outlasting everyone who laughed at him. Between the drooling and the wobbling, he produced serious intellectual work and outmaneuvered political rivals with real shrewdness, ruling Scotland for 58 years and England for 22. Satirists mocked the drool. Rivals learned to fear the brain behind it. A king, it turned out, needs a steady grip on power far more than steady legs. King Edward VI took the English throne at 9 and began dying at 15. His own journals record a perfectly healthy childhood right up until 1552 when measles found him, and something in the boy never recovered. Across his final months, physicians and foreign ambassadors described an emaciated frame, swollen and gangrenous extremities, and coughing fits that brought up putrefied matter from lungs rotting inside a living king. Ambassadors tracked the decay of a Tudor heir in something close to real time, and their dispatches spared no detail. The contrast with the healthy boy of the journals sharpened every report into something worse. Tudor England reached for the obvious explanation: poison. Rumor and propaganda accused John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, of murdering the boy king, a theory with tremendous dramatic appeal and, according to modern medical historians, nothing behind it. Their reconstruction runs colder and sadder. Measles suppressed Edward's immune system, and a latent tuberculosis infection, the disease his own century called consumption, reactivated and chewed through his lungs at horrifying speed. Poison told the better story, tuberculosis told the truer one. The pace of the decline threw the court into open panic because Edward carried the entire Tudor succession on his narrow shoulders, and his body kept failing faster than anyone could plan around. He could read his own prognosis. Desperate to keep the crown from his Catholic half-sister Mary, the dying king drafted his device for the succession and redirected the throne toward the Protestant Lady Jane Grey, the work of a 15-year-old rewriting a kingdom's future from his deathbed. Edward died in July 1553. The succession crisis he spent his last strength trying to prevent detonated almost immediately, short-lived, intense, and entirely of his own making. King Henry VIII opened his reign in 1509 as the athletic golden boy of European monarchy and closed it as a man who could barely cross a room. The hinge between those two Henrys sat in his legs, chronic ulcers opened on them and refused to heal, and the royal physicians documented the maintenance in queasy detail, recurring wounds that stank through his clothing and needed regular lancing to drain. The athletic youth ended on those wounds, and what remained grew heavier every year until the doctors found themselves managing a morbidly obese king who by then could barely move at all. The transformation registered on everyone who saw him across the decades. Ambassadors and courtiers who remembered the tall, athletic young king now described a swollen, suffering man whose wounds announced themselves by smell before he entered a room. His physicians could drain the ulcers but never close them, so treatment meant maintenance, and maintenance meant a lifetime subscription to pain. Modern medicine has circled Henry's chart for decades. A 2011 retrospective study proposed McLeod syndrome, a genetic disorder tied to the Kell blood group, as one elegant explanation covering both his physical collapse and his psychiatric deterioration. Tudor historians remain unconvinced. Without DNA evidence, the theory floats unanchored, and the more widely accepted hypotheses stay comparatively unglamorous. Type 2 diabetes, Cushing's syndrome, or osteomyelitis, a chronic infection burrowed into the bone itself. Each camp defends its diagnosis with the energy of people arguing over a patient 5 centuries past saving. Whatever destroyed the body, the pain rebuilt the politics. Historians widely point to the constant agony of his legs as a major driver of the paranoia, volatility, and tyranny that defined his later reign, which is a polite academic way of noting that when the royal ulcers flared, nobody at court stood entirely safe. The pattern repeated for years, the legs worsened, and the temper followed. Henry died in 1547 at 55. The most feared monarch in English history spent his final years unable to outrun a wound on his own leg. King Richard III carried the most famous spine in English history, and for 5 centuries nobody knew what it actually looked like. His contemporary, the chronicler John Rouse, noted only that Richard's shoulders sat unevenly. That single line held the entire honest record of the condition for half a millennium. Tudor propagandists inflated that modest observation into a monstrous hunchback complete with a withered arm, and Shakespeare hammered the caricature so deep into cultural memory that the last Plantagenet king spent 500 years wearing a deformity his enemies designed for him. Then the bones spoke. In 2012, osteoarchaeologists exhumed Richard's skeleton in Leicester and produced a definitive verdict: severe adolescent idiopathic scoliosis, a spinal curve of 60 to 80 degrees, with the right shoulder riding visibly higher than the left. Rouse told the truth, the propaganda did not, and no withered arm appeared anywhere on the remains. The discovery redrew the debate overnight. 500 years of arguments over whether the hunchback existed at all collapsed into a measured medical answer: real scoliosis, exaggerated propaganda. Researchers could finally separate the man's actual spine from the one his enemies invented, and the separation left both camps of the old argument partly right and mostly embarrassed. In life, Richard managed the condition with quiet professionalism. Expert tailors cut his armor and clothing to disguise the asymmetry, and the curve did nothing to keep him from leading cavalry charges in person at the Battle of Bosworth, where he died fighting in 1485 at 32. His body received its cruelest treatment after death. Tudor historians weaponized the scoliosis into a visual shorthand for moral corruption, so that every crooked portrait doubled as character assassination, and the smear held for centuries until a Leicester excavation put the actual vertebrae on the record. Science eventually straightened out the medical file. The reputation stays crooked to this day. King Edward I inherited a throne from his father, King Henry III, along with something more personal, a drooping left eyelid. The chronicler Nicholas Trevett recorded the trait passing straight from father to son. Manuscript illuminations occasionally capture it, and modern medical historians classify it without any struggle as congenital ptosis. Henry III carried the identical trait, which rendered the eyelid less an affliction and more an inheritance with paperwork. Nobody around Edward mistook it for weakness. At 6 feet 2 inches, Edward Longshanks towered over his century, and observers claimed the lopsided lid sharpened him rather than softening him, lending his stare a fierce, piercing quality whenever his temper rose. The court treated it as a Plantagenet family hallmark, not a disability. Chroniclers handled the eyelid the way they handled his height, as raw material for the legend of a fearsome king. On a monarch, nicknamed the Hammer of the Scots, a permanently half-lowered eyelid read less like a medical condition and more like a warning. Alfred the Great predates Britain itself. No such geopolitical entity existed in the 9th century, when Alfred ruled Wessex from 871 and later styled himself King of the Anglo-Saxons, but lists of British monarchs adopt him anyway, and his medical file earns the adoption. His illness introduced itself with vicious theatrical timing at his own wedding feast. We know the details because of Asser, the Welsh monk who wrote Alfred's biography and catalogued the royal ailments with startling candor. Asser describes sudden, agonizing internal pain that first seized the king mid-celebration and kept returning for the rest of his life, accompanied by weight loss, chronic abdominal misery, and hemorrhoids, a combination that left 9th century physicians completely baffled. Modern medical historians read the same symptom list and see Crohn's disease. Asser's account spares nothing. He describes a king who lived braced for the next attack, never certain when the pain would arrive or how long it would stay, and the uncertainty itself became a second layer of suffering on top of the physical kind. 9th century medicine held nothing that touched it. Now weigh his achievements against that diagnosis. While managing constant visceral pain and the fatigue that traveled with it, Alfred defended Wessex against the great heathen army, pioneered English naval defense, and drove a cultural and educational revival across his kingdom. Any one of those projects would strain a monarch in perfect health, and Alfred juggled all of them between attacks, on a schedule his intestines dictated. The suffering fed his legend instead of shrinking it, because chroniclers and later historians shaped Alfred into the pious, stoic hero king precisely on the grounds that he did all of it in agony, battling Vikings on the outside and his own intestines within. He died in 899. At around 50, the rare ruler whose greatest enemy lived inside his own body and never once managed to beat him.